Thank you. So it's hard to follow that talk, but I'm going to talk to you about the human motivation and how we go beyond just games. So the interesting thing, my background, I started developing games when I was 8 years old. I had my own games company when I was 11. I've developed games on multiple different platforms, and I didn't actually go into game design as a profession. I actually did AI research and actually went into business consulting and strategy consulting. But over the years, I've constantly tapped into every kind of game. I even researched board game design, Carcassonne we were just talking about. You know, the European games, you know, are so much further along than a lot of the games which we have over here in the board game community. And I created a creativity game. So my guilty secret is the fact that I actually prefer designing and developing games more than I actually play games. And that, to me, led me to a course which I started asking questions around, what is human motivation? And where does human motivation go beyond just games? And why am I at a gamification conference talking to you about this? So the interesting thing is, the human motivation, if you think about all the things people do which we don't have to do, you start realizing that human motivation goes so much further. Like knitting, reading a book is engaging, listening to music is engaging. And when I started peeling back the cover of understanding where the science, the neuroscience of understanding our brain has gone since I left academia about 20 years ago, we've gone so much further in understanding. And in the last 5 to 6 years, we're starting to understand how the motivational system of our brain actually works. And that, to me, has led me down to create what we call motivational design, and why we can go and work with large enterprise companies beyond just HR and training and marketing. We work on ERP systems, CRM systems, idea management systems, using principles of what engages people at a motivational circuit. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So Motivational GPS, I'm going to explain a little bit about that framework, how it works, and how we can use it to go further than just where we're going with games at the moment. So, interesting thing about how our motivational system works. The way we've been talking about motivation, even in the psychology community, is a little wrong when we start looking at how the motivational system works. So a lot of new science is showing us that liking and wanting are two different circuits, or actually related circuits, but two different circuits in our brain. And when I talk about motivation, we're talking about wanting. And this obviously talks about things like addiction and things like that, but it talks about what is engaging about games, but it also talks about what's engaging about reading a book, or knitting, or social connection. And that's where I think the future of motivational design is actually going. So let's take a little step back. We're all probably familiar with Skinner's rats, right? You know, they press a bar, get a bit of food. Interesting thing is, do you think the rat would press the bar more than once if it got a badge? Probably not, but the reason behind that starts speaking to what is different about our motivational system. You have to have something which is innately motivating to the creature, in this case a rat. And when it comes to humans, what is innately motivating to us is so much further and broader. But the idea is, without that reward, which is an innate reward, which is actually the liking, you can't actually have the wanting. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. So we start looking at different scenarios of what is actually happening in the rat's brain when it presses the lever. So I actually came up with this model where, you know, putting the wanting and liking. So the experiment was, the first time it was pressing the lever, it got trained to press the lever and got food. Then they started flashing a light before the lever was activated, which then turned into food. So now it's 2 cues, light, lever, and now the food. And that starts training the rat, that understanding that it doesn't pressing the lever when the light wasn't flashing didn't actually lead to food and a pleasure. And this is what we started calling their pleasure maps in our brain. So the interesting thing which we have to start understanding, and we're learning a lot more, is for a long time we believed our memory was to remember the past. It's actually to predict the future. I love this quote by Peter Thiel, you know, we wanted flying cars and all we got was 140 characters. But the idea behind predicting the future is how the motivational system actually works. Because what is that rat actually doing when he presses that lever, the light, the lever, and then getting the reward? It's mapping out how it gets to these pleasures. So food is pleasurable to them. So what it creates in your brain is a way of mapping this out. So they did experiments with monkeys as well, and this starts talking a little bit about what's actually happening in the brain. So between dopamine bursts and pauses, the brain actually starts guiding you towards what is rewarding. So in this experiment, they trained the monkey to expect a reward when the green light flashes. It gets a squirt of juice. So you start seeing, the first time through, you actually see the dopamine burst was when it actually got the reward. But what actually starts happening after it's been trained is the fact that the dopamine bursts happen when the light goes. So your brain is basically saying, I'm anticipating that I'm going to get a reward when I see a green light. So it gets really interesting when you have this idea of the blue light, which is a 50-50% of getting juice, that at the anticipation of it starts building. So you get the burst of dopamine because it thinks it's going to get a reward, and then the increasing anticipation while it's in that waiting mode is kind of what game designers have been using this for a long time. It's unpredictable rewards, variable schedule rewards, right? But this is what's happening in the brain. To me, this allowed me to start thinking a little differently about motivation. What is your brain actually doing when it's getting motivated, when it's wanting? It's actually starting to map out this unique world which we land in and finding out where all these pleasures are. We're innately born with a number of common pleasures which are rewarding to us. And our brain is designed to create that engagement when we stumble across it. You find one of these things which is motivating to you, and your brain starts mapping out how it got there. So you can repeat how you get there in the future. It's anticipating, it's creating a map. I started calling like pleasure maps, like a treasure map, because we're all born with this idea of buried pleasures. And through your life, you have trained yourself through different experiences, and your brain starts anticipating that certain things lead to those pleasures. And that starts creating what we call unique motivational DNA for each person. The actual breadth of the things which are motivating to humans, I initially thought was fairly complex. But what I started realizing was there's actually a core group of motivations. I mean, we just heard examples of these design patterns. What's behind a lot of those design patterns is human motivation. And I'm going to go walk through a couple of these, a couple of the most common ones, and show you how it actually is uniquely formed in our brain. So we've obviously got the common basic motivations like sex, food, right? And the fact that these are motivating or innately pleasurable. But what happens in a baby's brain is actually using the same motivational circuit. We call this bootstrapping. The interesting thing about humans is we have about 25,000 genes, give or take, right? Which is actually, there's blades of grass out there which have actually the same number of genes. What we've done with those 25,000 genes is create a fairly complex brain and a lot of the different things. The interesting challenge which how you create a brain like this without programming everything into it, evolution came up with an interesting trick, which is what we call bootstrapping. So instead of teaching a baby that it needs to learn to sit, crawl, and walk, it actually just, what it does in a developmental stage is doctors actually use this, between 0 and 3, there's certain milestones every baby goes through, and they can track how well a baby is developing based on these milestones. What actually happens in the brain is, at the point of crawling, the goal for crawling is put in as a motivational goal, and then the baby continuously crawls or keeps trying to crawl, and it develops the motor structures in the brain. So instead of having it in our DNA that the baby knows how to crawl, it just programs in the goal. So if you're a programmer, you'll probably understand. This is like similar to how we program in Prolog or Lisp and things like that. If you set a goal and then get the brain to program it, you don't actually have to have all the instructions set within the DNA. And this turns into a very interesting series of things, which turns into mastery. So if you think about after the age of 3, we still have this circuit which allows us to improve and get feedback and get motivated by learning new things and skills. So this idea of bootstrapping the brain turned into something which we all do, like mastering a game, mastering archery, all of these different things which through our lives, these are things that certain people have found motivational maps towards to find rewarding, and we've taken it much further than just the basic bootstrapping of the brain. The next one is learning. One of the core motivations which we're all born with is learning, this desire to learn. If you actually look at what what a baby is, their curiosity, their exploration, we all have elements of this. I've actually started thinking about this in the sense of, this idea of known knowns and known unknowns and unknowns unknowns. The whole, Donald Rumsfeld, he got joked about because he started talking about unknown unknowns. But in reality, the two different circuits in your brain, the two different motivational goals in your brain, allow you to explore a world in a very unique way. So curiosity is when there's a question, it is a known unknown. And you go and you want to close that information gap as you learn more. So writers use this for page-turning books. J.J. Abrams did it with great shows like Lost. He creates all these questions which you're driven in, and you're motivated and engaged as you learn more. The unknown unknown allows you to go out and explore new areas and get feedback for it. And the idea is, as food is not infinite. So for a creature to survive in this world, it has to, when it dries up a food source over here, it has to be motivated to go and explore new areas. And the interesting thing about this unknown unknown and this exploratory drive is for some people it's very strong, this novelty seeking. For other people, we also have an opposing fear of ambiguity and a fear of failure and uncertainty, which depending how that mix works in your brain, you might be very novelty-seeking and like new things and exploring new things, or you might be very fearful. We all have these motivational circuits, but which maps being laid out for you through your life, through your experiences, will dictate what's driving you. So the next one is, what we do a lot of in the gamification phase is what we call the two strong social motivations. Social competition is a very interesting motivation. We have a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos probably about 6 million to 7 million years ago. Chimpanzees are really interesting because they're a close cousin of ours. They're male-dominated hierarchies. They're aggressive, territorial, and are very sort of status-driven. Bonobos on the other side, which is also a relative of ours, are female-driven societies, egalitarian, and they're actually more trusting. They will share food with their opposing tribe, which chimpanzees will not do. We, as the third chimpanzee, actually have elements of both of this in our DNA. We actually can trust strangers, and we are fairly competitive. And depending which maps you've developed through your life, or what your DNA has led you to, could dictate if you're very competitive, or whether you're very collaborative. And we talk about the idea that the social motivations of competition comes down to status, but it also comes down to what we call fitness indicators. If you ever seen teenagers or have teenagers or remember what it was like to be a teenager, you get very interested in what's in and what's out, what's cool and what's not cool, right? These teenagers are driven, when that social motivation kicks in around those teenage years, they get very driven to work out what's in, because what they're trying to compete for is the attention of the opposite sex. And what is that social competitive drive is driven by some of this fitness. So what is a peacock's tail to attract their mate also turns into, in humans, cars and makeup and dresses and music you listen to. All of these things are indicators to the opposite sex of what is important to you so you can attract them. The other side of this is what we call ocean. So unlike where our history was, where it was a very male-dominated, hierarchical, tribal community which we grew out of, where the top-ranking male got all the females, when this world where it's actually far more complex, we actually start looking at far more characteristic cues of what is a personality. And they call this ocean. How open you are, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, and neurotic are different elements. And the different makeup each person has is very unique. But we show these off in everything we do. The clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the books we read. If you look at Facebook, Facebook is one of these, what we call a statistical amplifier. You tell your story of who you are and the friends you're friends with, the things you like and the things you dislike. You're always telling a story about who you are, how unique you are. And this is one aspect of the social competitive drive, but it's not as competitive as the win-lose kind of structure. But it is a very driven part, that part of the brain. The other side of the brain is obviously cooperation. We can trust. We have empathy. We consider reputation to be very important. As a society, we've had to learn to trust strangers. We're 7 billion people on the planet this year, and we're growing still. We started with a tribe of about 10,000 people out of Africa, and now we're 7 billion people. We're not used to being surrounded by strangers. We're used to being surrounded by our tribe constantly. But we can trust people we've never met before. But we're very clued into understanding things like fairness. If somebody cheats you, you'll go out of your way to make sure that they pay for it. We're social policers constantly. And this is all to do with how we cooperate with each other and can live together. We have this social cooperation drive driving us down. The other side of this is obviously empathy. We can, through mirror neurons and oxytocin, we can form bonds and feel the pain of somebody else or the pleasure of somebody else. And this is also considered part of our social cooperation motivation. So all of this makes up a really interesting, unique motivational DNA for each one of you. Depending which maps you've laid out in your life, what experiences you've had, you've started creating these very unique experiences. So how does this motivational system actually work in your brain? The way that dopamine's firing is kind of like what we call like the children's game of warmer and colder. You know, you blindfold a child and you have a toy and it's going, you're getting warmer, warmer, colder, hot. What that child's doing is creating what we call sort of a heat map of where it thinks that pleasure is going to find. That's what your brain's doing when it finds or is moving towards a reward. So how this actually works out is kind of like the analogy I came up with. It's like a compass and an old map with these innate cues and these unique experiences you've created to your life. Your brain is kind of acting like this compass. You know, which direction am I going? Am I moving towards, empathy? Am I moving towards exploration? You know, where am I anticipating my predicted future rewards going to come from? I'm using a compass and a map, a very crude map. What we can do with software is actually change that, and that's what we call the motivational GPS. So if you think about games is one aspect and taps into so many different motivations, but when you look at the breadth of the things which people do and which they don't have to do, it goes so much further than that. Knitting, reading circles, all of these things. And these are the unique motivational DNAs. So with Cynergy, what we've started doing is not only do we have these pattern library, but we've actually started working out how we create engagement in the employee workforce, whether it's a workflow system or an ERP system or an idea management system or a marketing with consumer system. We can design experiences because what we've taken is our understanding of motivation and we've started doing what we call a motivational GPS. So take that crude compass which we had, and now through software, we can actually give you cues to the long-term goals. Through software feedback, it's the idea like a turn-by-turn direction of a motivational GPS. So if you start understanding that, you might be driven for fats and sugars, which probably made a lot of sense on the savannas of scarce energy sources, but today we're surrounded by so much food and energy that we overeat. We eat sugar far too much and we put on weight. Storing fat was something which allowed us to survive through periods of no food. But today we're surrounded by food. This doesn't make sense anymore. So if you think about where we should be focusing on, we can create software to give you that long-term goal setting to actually get to eat less, to exercise more, and this can be done through motivational cues. So giving your brain the feedback it actually needs, talking to that motivational part of your brain in something which makes sense through software cues, we can actually craft and create the behaviors which the user really wants. So Cynergy is obviously very focused on understanding the core motivation of what drives user behavior and then designing software for them. So as much as a lot of customers come to us and say, we want our customers to do X or we want our employees to do Y, we turn it around and go, what do they really want to do? We believe if you can tap into the innate motivations and understand the unique motivational DNA pattern of each employee or each customer, you can start designing the right kinds of software. We have a lot of enterprise systems out there which then use email to remind somebody to do something. Oh, you haven't entered your time in. You haven't put your expense report in. Anytime you have to use email to get somebody to use one of your software packages, that is motivational design fail. So you're not understanding what is driving that user. Why aren't they doing that? What have you made really hard for them? Understanding what is motivational to them, we can start designing these systems. So that's what we do through what we call the motivational design, motivational GPS, and a framework of tools which we call the motivational design pattern library. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kes. We have time for 2 questions. Kes has also got a booth out in the lobby, so after those two, please go ahead and visit Cynergy there. Anyone have a question?
How can we see the motivational design pattern library?
How can you see it? Work with
Yes.
Cynergy. No, so I'm actually working on a book. I'm about 80% done. The fortunate and unfortunate situation of having such a good conference at Gamification. When I came to Gamification in New York in September, ever since then, we got so many customers coming to us. I've been on the road constantly and working. So it's nearly done. The book will be out soon, I promise.
Yes, I do SAP projects. I implement them, and my question is, where do I start for the motivational design for SAP projects?
Sorry, say that again?
Where do I start for the motivational design for SAP projects, ERP software? Boring, boring, boring.
Where do you start?
Yeah, where do I start?
Well, so where we would start obviously understanding a little bit more about your users. What are they trying to use that system for? And then try to make sure that we use design. I mean, we're great designers. We've been doing aesthetically pleasing things for so long. But when you start tapping into what is actually a better cue and feedback for systems to solve those problems, like workflow systems or ERP systems, we can start designing the right kind of motivational cues for that. So creating that design layer on top of some of the ERP systems is what we end up doing. So understanding users is always where it starts.
Yeah, understanding users. I think we have a long way to go, but I believe your story. Thank you.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Kes. That was great.